So this week in the Sacred Gathering, I'm going to actually break with the traditional lectionary reading and just kind of continue the passage we looked at last week out of First Peter. It continues a lot of the themes. We talked a lot about how First Peter does a lot of this kind of oppositional language, right? There's like some us versus them, God's kingdom versus the world, our interior life versus our exterior life. So that theme continues. But this section is gonna bring in kind of another major thing, and that's what's sometimes called the eschatology, or kind of a theology of end times. The fact that we believe God will decisively act at the end of human history, that human history is heading towards something with which we can kind of participate or oppose, is going to be really important for the section we're going to look at. It's very important for the New Testament overall. It's very important for the book of First Peter. Now, as I say that, I decided to continue kind of reading the section. This section follows up right after what we looked at last week. Largely because of this first section, it just picked up a theme that I like. I like talking about, and it's one that grabbed me. And I'll admit, I felt a little ambushed as I began my prep on this section, because I think I jumped at a few verses I liked very quickly without realizing what this section was actually about, what's actually being argued here, which I'm less comfortable with. And it reminded me that all of us need to be careful, right? We tend to snatch at verses that reinforce the things we like, or sometimes will, reinforce the things that we already believe. We tend to draw towards those, and we tend to ignore or just not want to interact with verses we like less. In fact, I was struck by the fact that this section I'm going to read, not only do I not like it, apparently other people don't like it very much either. The lectionary, the traditional readings, just skips right over this section. It jumps from what we read last week to the section afterwards, which was interesting. And we'll talk about maybe why we don't like this, but I think it reminds us that when we run into passages that we don't particularly like, we have to be careful not to just simply avoid them, or to find a way to say, well, that was, culturally that was appropriate, it doesn't really apply to me. To undercut its authority simply because we don't like it. We also have to be very careful, I think. Certain traditions, certain maybe just personalities prefer to kind of solve things. If there's something that comes and causes us some dissonance, it's not more spiritual to just simply say, well, I just trust, I'll have faith, that it'll all make sense in the end. I don't disagree with those statements, but I think at times trying to harmonize, trying to not have any problems with the text, not feeling like I said, that dissonance, I don't think that's more spiritual. Having all the answers, having solved these sections, I think the willingness to wrestle, the willingness to let the texts, even ones we don't like, form us, is an important part of the life of faith, which is this give and take of trusting kind of who we are and the personalities God has given us and the traditions that we maybe sit with, and sections that don't fit so well, some sections that give us some dissonance, that may want to change us or form us in ways we're not expecting and don't necessarily like. So that's a long introduction to this section, but this is just a lot of what I was wrestling with going into this. So I'll kind of break it down into three big sections, and we'll talk about what it is maybe this has for all of us. Okay, so this first section, this is the section that grabbed me, that I liked. This section was easier for me. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, we read, "Dear friends, since you are immigrants and strangers in the world, I urge that you avoid worldly desires that wage war against your lives. Live honorably among unbelievers. Today they defame you as if you were doing evil. But in the day when God visits to judge, they will glorify him because they have observed your honorable deeds." So, one of the things I like about this section is it's a strong theme in this section and other parts of the New Testament, simply that, again, we are immigrants, we are strangers in the world, we are resident aliens, we are ambassadors. We talked about this last week, that, to quote the song that we're going to sing on Sunday, this world isn't ultimately our home. Now, that can lead to some problematic where people don't engage with the world around them, right? Where they can say, like, well, just this doesn't really matter. It's all about getting to heaven where my real home is. I would say that's a problematic way of approaching, because Jesus was deeply engaged with the world around him, right? God likes the world. He died for the world. He sends his people into the world to heal and to make it better. But we can also become too comfortable in our host cultures. We can also become too at home with the ways of thinking in which we were brought up, right? And I don't think that that's a new insight. For most of us at Wayfarers, who, like it or not, we tend to be a little bit of misfits. And so sections like this is just a good reminder. We need to ultimately be strangers in this world. The values of the world around us, whether that's what you have to do to be valuable, who is valuable, what success looks like, how we should be spending our time and our money, etc., right? What is ultimately important. We don't really agree with most of the answers that are provided by our culture in those areas. We are kingdom people. Those are defined by God. Those are defined by Jesus. And so it's just kind of important for us to remember, and I think this section is a good one. It's not just that we are different and that we are opposed. It's that those things are actually harmful. God knows what wholeness and goodness looks like. That's what the kingdom is inviting us into, a life that at times feels counterintuitive, but that's simply because the world is broken and wrong, right? And I like the way he says it here. He says, avoid worldly desires, not because they're going to, taint you in some way, not because you're showing how spiritual you are by being different than everyone else. He says simply, I urge you to avoid worldly desires because they wage war against your very lives or against your very souls, is another way. Like, we were designed in a certain way, and most of the things that our culture values, most of the things we're told we should be spending our time and money, attention on, are things that are actually harming who we are actually, right? That are harming us as people, as God's children. And that's true of everyone, whether they believe in God or not, whether they understand themselves as God's beloved children. The things going on around us so much of the time are just doing deep harm, because that's not actually what a human being is. And it's a good reminder that that invitation that often does feel self-sacrificial or counterintuitive is simply because we've been trained wrong. And God is trying to invite us back into real life, back into kind of our real selves and our real souls, right? So, okay, so far, so good. And then at the end of this section, we do get that eschatological theme, that end times theme, right? It says, okay, today they defame you. They don't get what you're about. They might even think you're immoral, as if you were doing evil, right? Because there is criticism in kingdom life of the host culture around it. It's focused on the wrong things. It's doing harm, sometimes even where it thinks it's doing good. And, on the day when God visits to judge, they will glorify him because they have observed your honorable deeds. And this vindication, this trusting that God is going to be the one that shows us kind of ultimately what was right, is it's an important thing for us to remember, that we don't have to justify ourselves. We don't have to prove ourselves. But as the Bible scholar N.T. Wright put it, he's like, okay, but we have some responsibility for the way we're doing that. When the end of the world comes, is the world around us going to say, wow, they were right all along. They stuck to their guns. They did good things. And even though we criticize them, even though we cause them to suffer at times, it turns out they were right. They actually were serving and loving. Or are they going to say, boy, for people who are supposed to know what God was all about, for people who are supposed to be bringing this message of hope and healing and God's work in the world to us, they sure made a mess of that message. That's not what I was seeing in their lives. That's not what I was hearing from them. I was hearing something else. If we're being completely honest, they are probably going to end up saying both about us, right? We are a mixed bag. We're not doing what we're supposed to. But Peter here is trying to inspire us, saying, okay, do good things, do right things, do goddish things in the world, even if they're unappreciated, because hopefully at the end of time, God comes and shows up. Everyone's like, oh, yeah, they were right. They were actually doing things that were real and true and fit with God and the way the world actually is, not, I'm feeling a little cheated right now because you guys had the message of life and you spent all your time and energy doing those things. So that's, I think, the positive contrast, the invitation here. And then we get into this next section. And let me just read it and say, this is the section where I feel dissonance. This is the section I struggle with. And they are implications of everything what we've just been saying. Okay, so Peter continues. For the sake of the Lord, submit to every human institution. Do this whether it means submitting to the emperor as supreme ruler, or to governors as those sent by the emperor. They are sent to punish those doing evil and to praise those doing good. Submit to them because it's God's will that by doing good, you will silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Do this as God's slaves, and yet also as free people, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Honor everyone, love the family of believers, have respectful fear of God, honor the emperor. Household slaves, submit by accepting the authority of your masters with all respect. Do this not only to good and kind masters, but also to those who are harsh. Now it is commendable if, because one's understanding of God, someone should endure pain through suffering unjustly. But what praise comes from enduring patiently when you have sinned and are beaten for it? But if you endure steadfastly, when you've done good and suffer for it, this is commendable before God. So, okay, I hate this section. Section I struggle with for kind of two reasons. One is the way sections like this have been used historically. And that is they've been kind of used as a weapon. So this submit to every human institution. This has been used by tons and tons of human institutions saying, no, we have God's backing. Because we are a human institution, you have to submit to us because that's what God wants you to do, right? It's been used as a weapon against people who are considering rebellion or who are critiquing those in power. I don't think it can be used that way. This section is insider language. It is talking to other disciples, other people who are following Christ, and trying to give them a perspective on what human institutions are. So one reason I don't like that is because, and I'm a good American, I guess. I've listened to too much punk rock. I like the idea of when I feel that I am righteous, when I can see things clearly, I should be allowed to rebel, right? I don't have to do those things. I can undercut those things, especially when my criticisms of power and institution are often right. And you get that attitude in a lot of modern scholarship saying, well, okay, this section couldn't be telling you to submit because of the way it's traditionally been used. It has been used by those in power as a weapon against those with not, saying you need to submit to us. When Peter is not saying you get to tell that to somebody else, but at the same time, there is something going on here. It's not saying that power is inherently good. It's not saying anything about that just because something exists means God supports us. It's actually the opposite. It's saying you are submitting and showing God's goodness even when those in power aren't doing their job. But I think where I struggle and where I struggle with ways to use is that we still are saying that we are ultimately called to suffer and we're ultimately called to submit. That is the kind of classic accusation against that stance. People say it's too quietist. It allows too much evil in the world. It is encouraging things to be the way they are when I think God's heart is aching for things in the world. And I think that rebellion inside of us and this struggle with these chapters is a really important one to wrestle with. How do we deal with that? How do we sit in those two places? Because I want to just simply be right and rebel. The problem is, of course, that's what both sides are generally saying in our modern politics. They feel righteous. They feel that God is on their side, and therefore they are justified in using the tools of violence or slander or anything else, using the system to undercut those because they're sure they're right. When both sides think God is on their side, we need to consider a third way. I really feel this tension on the next section too, right? Because right after that, what does he say? Household slaves, submit by accepting the authority of your masters with all respect, not only to good and kind masters, but those also who are harsh. Again, these were favorite verses of slave holders and slave owners. They said, nope, you need to submit to us because God supports this institution. God wants this to be the way it is. And the fact that anybody could hold another human being enslaved and think that God is approving and excited about that just makes me fighting mad. I think it makes God fighting mad that they're using it this way. This again, verse is a little hard to apply to kind of American chattel slavery and other modern ones because it looked nothing like what slavery was in the ancient world. But that aside, the argument is still one I struggle with. You don't just submit to the good. You don't just submit to things that are fair and right. There's a submission and a working within the system that doesn't feel like it's undercutting it enough for my tastes, because that's what Christ was willing to do, to experience injustice in both of those. And again, I think that's the important thing, and what was wrong about the way that these verses have been used, whether it's submit to authority, whether it's submit to institutions, submit to the way things are, submit even to horrors like slavery, right? When those are pulled out of this bigger context and talking to disciples, we use that as a weapon against other people. We do more harm in the world, but we're often cutting out this last important section, which I'm not sure I feel any more comfortable with, but I think this whole argument pins on this last section. You were called to this kind of endurance because Christ suffered on your behalf. He left you an example so that you might follow in his footsteps. He committed no sin, nor did he ever speak in ways meant to deceive. When he was insulted, he did not reply with insults. When he suffered, he did not threaten revenge. Instead, he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He carried in his own body on the cross the sins we committed. He did this so that we might live in righteousness, having nothing to do with sin. By his wounds you were healed. Though you were like straying sheep, you have now returned to the shepherd and the guardian of your lives. So it's important for me to kind of remind myself that Christ will never ask us to do something hard or counterintuitive, or even sometimes that might feel like we're doing something that is wrong, that he was not willing to do for himself. Jesus is the one person who can claim, I'm right. I actually can have the correct perspective on all institutions, on all these things. I know how to undercut them. I know when to rebel. I know what they are supposed to look like, right? And yet Christ submitted to injustice. He allowed the cross, right? The cross, the ultimate injustice, humanity torturing and making God become sin because we were wrong, because we didn't want anything to do with his ways, because we wouldn't trust God and created sin in the first place. And God takes that within himself, unjustly suffers sin, death, the one person who didn't have to suffer those things, that all might be healed. And that is the only reason he is willing to ask us to follow into death, into the horrors of injustice at times. God only is willing to ask that because he's with us. And I think that is the important thing that we need to remember as we continue on. God is asking us not to pick up the tools and fight back or submit in the ways the world is asking us to. Because he, like Jesus, he's inviting us into a third way. He's inviting us to have kind of a prophetic voice that says, I will not use the tools and break this, but I will follow Christ. I can see what this thing actually is because we stand apart. We can prophetically call it what it is, knowing that we likely will suffer and be misunderstood, and the world will not be fixed. It's not necessarily going to feel like it's working, but that's, I think, the amazing thing about this is ultimately this only works because we have a Savior God. If we were simply looking at how to change the world to fit our vision better, yes, it makes sense why we are going to pick up the tools of violence or political revolution or of control of a culture, or et cetera, to make things align. This only works, this submitting to it and quietly keeping our prophetic voice in a third way, only works if there's an actual God. It only works if Christ is really in the world and in our hearts, changing things and making things better. And I think that's the piece that we're so often missing, is it only works if at the end of time God is intending on making all things better. And he's intending on that kind of coming that coming healing of the entire world, echoing even into the present time. It echoes from the future to now, which is hard to get our hearts and minds around, except we do experience it and we do see it at times and in ways, right? The early church, I think, is a wonderful example of this. This is a group of people who did not have power, who did not have any kind of cultural influence or whatever, right? Many of the tools that we are willing to use to try and remake the world in the way we think we see God. There were people who were willing to use violence. There were people who were willing to rebel in the kind of more traditional ways. Jesus rejected that as well. And the early church followed, not because it worked, but because this is how they felt being faithful was the slow, quiet, local work of taking care of people and being God's presence in the world. And the church grew in incredible ways because people were hungry for that kind of world, because they were willing to do another one. I think I was reading something recently about just kind of a history of human rights and where even that idea that all human beings have value. And the argument this article was making was that is a deeply Christian idea. Jesus' value of even the least and the least useful and children, etc., is there are, people will push back on this, but the argument was that the origin of that really is Jesus' teaching and God's work in the world. And we've seen that as basically in the modern world, largely an assumption by huge numbers of people that all human beings have an inherent dignity and have an inherent right? That did not come from on high and seizing power and forcing it on people. It was the long, slow work of God marinating and helping people to see the world differently. And so I struggle with sections like this. I struggle wondering what it looks like to be faithful. I want to go out and do things. I want to change the world. I want to fix things because they are wrong. I have God's heart at my best moments, that things are not fair and that things need to change. And yet, I think this section is asking us to trust Christ and follow his way, to be willing to step into suffering and to be willing to step into being misunderstood, not because it's effective, but because it is God's voice and because God can use things like that to reform me and my heart and all the things that I hate in the world that I find reflected and forming in my own heart, so we can continue to be part of the kingdom, continue to be part of God's work. So there are good people out there who love God who are going to disagree with me in my interpretation of a lot of this. I love you. Please teach me. Please help me get this thing right. But I think we need to be willing to sit with this in a way that I don't necessarily want to. I don't like the conclusions here, but I think this section is offering, if we really do want to be immigrants, strangers in the world, separate people, are we willing to do that through suffering, willing to do that through Jesus' methods, even when it doesn't feel like it's going to work, even though it doesn't feel like it's enough, and trusting the way God does things in the world and trusting what God is up to in human history?